Welcome classic rock fans to an episode of 10 bands that I love, or 10 more bands that I love, as an antidote to the 10 more bands that I hate, which I think I posted a few weeks ago. That got you all riled up, didn't it? Anyway, enough of this blather, let's get on with it, shall we? Number 10 is The Cure. I admit I've arrived rather late to the party with this band. I've only kind of recently gotten into them. Oh, I do remember Robert Smith in the 80s looking very cool, I think, with his makeup and nonchalant shrug. Although these days he tends to resemble my Aunt Mabel, the gin years. But they are still fabulous live, apparently, and I do intend to see them on the next tour, if there is a next tour. They have got a new album coming out as well, which I shall certainly be buying that. But I enjoy the jangle of this band's music and that thrumming bass, and Robert Smith's pained mewing. Favourite albums for me would have to be this one, Disintegration, which I have done a video on my channel about. And this one, of course, I do like a bit of pornography. Number 9 is the Beach Boys. I mean, the caveat really is, for me, the Beach Boys from around about sort of 66, about 71. I was just captivated by the sheer brilliance of their arrangements. And as well you know, I absolutely adore the album Pet Sounds. And Smile, for that matter. I love those early sort of bubblegum tunes as well. I perhaps shouldn't, I don't know, but I really enjoy them. And I still think the Beach Boys' Christmas album is one of the best albums in that kind of genre. Not as good as the Phil Spector Christmas album, but it's pretty well up there, I think. But this band kind of drifted away, I think, when Paul Brian Wilson kind of drifted away and Mike Love assumed kind of creative control over the band. And Brian was sat upon by Eugene Landy. I think a lot of the stuff they did in the 70s and the 80s was pretty generic stuff. And I must admit, the Summer in Paradise album is probably the worst things I've ever had to listen to. But this band between 65 and 69 was something else. Very American, very wholesome, as wholesome as drive-in movies and homemade apple pie, laced with LSD, no doubt. Paul McCartney famously said that God Only Knows is one of the greatest songs ever written, or maybe the greatest song ever written, but I find it hard to argue with him on that one. Number 8 is the Kinks. I mean, this is a band to me that are firmly rooted in the UK in terms of their writing, especially after they started to leave behind those early R&B roots to produce these kind of scathing vignettes and character sketches. Certainly, they employed a lot of what I call vaudeville and musical sensibilities, as did a lot of those English bands during the psychedelic period. But for me, this was very much a part of Ray Davies' writing and aesthetic. But they always seemed a little bit out of step, I think, by the time we got to the late 60s, and certainly suffered for it. But they came sort of eclipsed by the apocalyptic threat and thrum of the Stones, especially with Gimme Shelter, and the brilliance of the Beatles, of course. Let's not forget the destructive rage of The Who, as they were exploring a society's spiritual mutism through the symbol of the deaf, dumb and blind boy, that pinball wizard. Meanwhile, this band were kind of critiquing Englishness through the medium of potted jams and summer fates, their music bobbing along like a horse and buggy against England's hedgerows and meadows. They were certainly unique. Number 7 is Ryan Adams. I love the pained anguish of this guy's songs. Incredibly prolific artist. He's produced so many albums exploring punk, alt-rock to country. From the radio-friendly rock of Gold to the devastatingly beautiful album which is Heartbreaker, to the Grateful Dead homage, Cold Roses. I think this guy is a remarkable songwriter. If you don't believe me, go and listen to Magnolia Mountain, just one song. His finest albums, in my opinion, are Cold Roses, as I've mentioned, Gold, Heartbreaker, Prisoner's a great one. But I like Wednesdays. Wednesdays is a more recent album. I think that latter album is quite cathartic, given his cancellation and the sort of stuff he was accused of. Saw him at the Leicester de Montfort Hall a few years ago. Brilliant performer. Number 6 is Deep Purple. This band was my introduction to rock and metal, along with Iron Maiden's Number of the Beast and Motorhead's No Sleep to Hammersmith. But for me, it was that Made in Japan album, which I got to know very, very well before I got to know the studio material. But from the get-go, I loved Ian Gillan's ballooning vocals and glass-worrying shriek, to Blackmore's guitar pyrotechnics and John Lord's throbbing organ. I was very lucky, I think, to have seen the Mark II lineup many, many years ago. And I got to meet the band when they played the Newcastle City Hall, not the Mark II lineup, but the then incarnation. In fact, I've still got this as part of one of the prized items in my collection is this programme, signed beautifully in silver pen by them all, including the late, great John Lord. In terms of their best album, for me, it would be a toss-up between In Rock and Machine Head. Machine Head's been elevated slightly, in my opinion, since the Dweezil Zappa remix. I love that remix, and it's very rare that I'm always interested in remixes, but they very rarely a new mix replaces the original mix. But in this case, I would listen to Dweezil's remix over the original any day. But I think Deep Purple in the 70s were kind of seen as the poor relation to Led Zeppelin, although I think they were better. Although I like a lot of those bands that were seen as a kind of a poor relation to the tight-trousered priapic strut of Robert Plant, bands like Uriah Heep and UFO. I love those guys. Number 5 is Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. I mean, Nick Cave stalks that stage like some prehistoric bird. The goth Sinatra, I think Rolling Stone dubbed him. I must admit I prefer the albums from The Good Son onwards, as they're far more melodic, I think, rather than the chaotic clatter of those early records and the stuff he did with The Birthday Party. This guy exudes a special kind of gloominess, a consummate heroin addict. In fact, after reading Ian Johnston's Nick Cave biography, I'm surprised the guy's still around. I adore the macabre moochings of murder ballads. I particularly love The Boatman's Call, and Push the Sky Away is another favourite of mine. A special shout out has to go to his newer album, Wild God. That's a great record, very gospel infused. There's a joyous feel to it almost, which is quite nice considering the very dark and very challenging albums he put out prior to that one, Carnage and Ghosteen, obviously feeding off the grief of the tragic loss of his son. Number 4 is Merian. I mean, this band have an almost cult-like status, although some subscribers have said that they feel I'm a cult. It might have just been a typo, though. The fans are often drawn into two camps, those that favour the he of the trouty pout and those that like the Byronic foppishness of Hogarth. I love both of them, to be honest with you. I mean, Fish prowling about those early stages with that face paint, what an imposing figure he cut with Grendel, or Supper's Ready Mark II as I call it, and that tortured debut album. Likewise Hogarth, what a brilliant writer he is, Out of This World and the wonderful New Kings. Best albums in my opinion, Fear, Marbles, Script and Misplaced Childhood. There are those that refuse to listen to anything post Seasons That End and tend to excoriate this fishless band, or maybe fillet is a more appropriate verb here. One of the prized items in my collection is this signed copy of Misplaced Childhood. Glorious stuff. Number 3 is Neil Young, and Neil Young with Crazy Horse. The distorted, meandering canter of this band is certainly my bag of feed. I'll see if I can think of any more equine gags to throw into this review. I love the album Ragged Glory, as well as the more introspective stuff. I never tire of listening to Harvest and After the Gold Rush. I mean, this guy is so prolific. I mean, he squeezes albums out like turds. In fact, he's probably floated another couple whilst I've been filming this video. There are some clunkers in his back catalogue, there's no doubt about that, but he's done enough stuff that is just absolutely brilliant, I think, that I can kind of gloss over those. A later album that I did enjoy was Psychedelic Pill. I think Ramada Inn is a fine bit of writing, although his rant against MP3 certainly went on a bit, a whole side of vinyl in fact. My God, I wish he'd compressed that. Number 2 is The Who. The Who are the spirit of rock and roll according to Grail Marcus at Rolling Stone magazine. This is a band that sonically just shouldn't work, but somehow do. I mean, you get that well-orchestrated noise that is held together by Daltrey at the front of it all. How he finds any space amongst that incessant barrage and clatter is beyond me. Ours is a music with built-in hatred, said Pete Townsend. No shit, but my God, it's absolutely awesome. Daltrey said he's not that keen on the Live at Leeds album, which I think is the finest live album ever in my opinion. He says, you struggle to sing because the band was so bloody loud. In fact, he says the Live at Hull album is actually much better than the Live at Leeds album. You must check that one out. My favourite albums by The Who are got to be Tommy, The Who Sell Out and Who's Next, of course. Number 1 is Genesis. I must admit my preference is for the more hymnal, pastoral tones of those early Gabriel albums. That clarion call for nationhood and him prowling the stages like some malevolent begonia. Even the conceptual extravagance of The Lamb, that batshit bonkers album, is easily probably my favourite Genesis album. But I adore the commercial stuff as well, that chino, trousered, blonde, highlighted look that they had. In fact, the self-titled Genesis album is one of my favourites. Love that album. Nothing like a bit of Home by the Sea. If I had to choose a favourite album by this band, it would be a toss-up between Selling England by the Pound and The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. Although Nursery Crime is a really important album in this band's back catalogue, with the dark, gothic Victoriana of a musical box, and that pesky infestation of Herculean Mantagazzi. But I must admit I absolutely slather over this band in all their incarnations. Anyway, there you are, there you have it. 10 more bands that I absolutely love. If you've enjoyed this video, please do share it. Click like, subscribe, check that notification bell as Steven Tyler sings so you don't miss a thing. And check some of the links below this video for ways you can support the sterling work. And a classic album review, it's always much appreciated. Anyway, I shall leave it there and leave you with my closing salvo, which is, as you know, hope you're well, staying safe, and of course that you keep listening.